You know that feeling when you see someone and your brain just stops working? Not the movie version. Not slow-motion hair flip, violin music in the background. I mean the real version, where you're mid-sentence and suddenly you forget what words are, where your chest does something medically concerning, and you just stand there looking like you've never seen a person before in your life. That's where this story starts. Not with a war, not with an invasion, not with any of the things that were quietly being decided in rooms none of us knew existed yet. It starts with a man who fell in love at the worst possible moment in human history. And somehow, that turned out to matter more than anyone expected. His name was Daniel Mercer, and he was 31 years old, working as a cultural liaison at the United Earth Reception Facility in Geneva, which was a very official title for a job that mostly involved making sure alien dignitaries didn't accidentally eat something lethal at the welcome banquets. He was good at it, quietly competent, the kind of person who solved problems before anyone noticed they existed. He spoke 4 languages, knew the dietary restrictions of 11 species, and had once talked a 6-armed ambassador out of a diplomatic crisis caused by the wrong color of tablecloth. Nobody would have called him extraordinary. He would have agreed with them. The morning everything changed, he was standing at the east entrance of the facility, holding a translation tablet and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, watching the Velorian delegation arrive. The Velorians were humanity's newest contact. 3 months since first signal, 6 weeks since formal introduction, 2 weeks since they agreed to send a cultural exchange team to Earth. Everyone was nervous. The Velorian homeworld was twice the size of Earth, their civilization 4,000 years older, and their reputation in the wider galactic community was something between deeply respected and mildly terrifying. The shuttle landed. The ramp descended, and Daniel Mercer forgot how to hold a coffee cup. She walked out third in the delegation line, tall, even by Velorian standards, with silver-white hair that caught the morning light like it had its own agenda. Her eyes were a shade of amber that didn't exist in any Earth color chart he'd ever seen. She wore the deep blue of the Velorian diplomatic corps, but she wore it the way people wear clothes when they've never once thought about what they're wearing. Like it was just there. Like everything else in the room was just there. She was talking to the delegate beside her, something low and measured, and she almost smiled at whatever the response was. Almost. Like she'd learned smiling was a thing people did, but wasn't entirely sold on it yet. Daniel realized he'd been staring for an uncomfortable amount of time. He looked down at his tablet, looked back up. She was looking directly at him. Not with hostility, not with curiosity exactly, more like assessment. The way someone looks at a door they haven't decided to open yet. He looked away first, obviously. Her name, according to the official manifest, was listed under her title, Third Voice of the Velorian Diplomatic Assembly. Her actual name was 23 syllables long and required a sound the human mouth couldn't make without practice. The facility staff had been asked to use the shortened form. Sarah, the chief of protocol, a sharp woman named Director Yoon, pulled Daniel aside before the first formal meeting. "You're assigned to the third voice," she said, in the tone of someone delivering information they know will cause problems. Daniel blinked. "Me, specifically?" "She requested you specifically. She doesn't know me. She knows you were the one who read the full Velorian cultural briefing document, all 412 pages of it. Apparently that's not nothing to them." Director Yoon gave him a look he couldn't fully interpret. "Also, I suspect she saw you staring at her from the landing pad, so..." Daniel had nothing useful to say to that. "Don't make it weird," Director Yoon added, already walking away. "The thing nobody tells you about working with someone brilliant is that it sneaks up on you." The first week, Daniel was professional. Excellent, even. He navigated the cultural briefings, the protocol sessions, the complicated diplomatic meals where 17 things could go wrong and usually 3 of them did. He translated not just language but intention. He caught things, the slight tension in her voice when certain topics came up, the questions she asked that weren't really the questions she was asking. He started anticipating her before she spoke, finished clarifying something for her before she had to request it. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. The second week, she started asking him things that weren't on any official agenda. What do humans do when they're frightened but can't show it? Why does your music use minor keys for sadness when the Velorian equivalent is a drop in tempo? What does the ocean sound like at night? And why do so many humans describe it as lonely, when it seems to them it would be the opposite? He answered everything. Honestly, which surprised him because he was usually better at being professionally vague. The third week, they stayed late in the briefing room after everyone else had left, talking about nothing in particular. A conversation that had no meeting agenda, no protocol purpose, no reason to exist except that neither of them stopped it. He told her about his grandmother's garden in Ohio. She told him something about the Velorian concept of time that made him sit in silence for a while, processing it. It was late when they finally stood to leave. At the door, he paused. She was standing close enough that he could see the faint luminescence that Velorian's skin had in low light, something the briefing documents had mentioned but somehow failed to adequately describe. He thought something he absolutely should not have thought. I wish I could marry her. It was not a logical thought. They were from different worlds, different species, technically, though Velorian biology was compatible enough with human biology that the distinction was philosophically complicated. He worked for her, in a manner of speaking. She was going home in 3 weeks. The list of reasons this thought was unreasonable was long and well organized. He said none of this out loud. He was a professional. He nodded goodnight and turned toward the corridor. Daniel, her voice stopped him. The way a hand on your shoulder stops you, except it was just sound. He turned back. Sarah was looking at him with that same expression from the landing pad. That door she hadn't decided to open yet, look. Except something in it had shifted. Something had been decided. You are thinking something you are choosing not to say, she said. Not a question. His heart was doing something inadvisable. Occupational habit. Velorians consider unexpressed thoughts to be unfinished conversations. A pause. We find it discourteous. He looked at her. She looked at him. It was nothing important, he said. She tilted her head, just slightly. I have worked with 7 human liaisons across 4 facilities on this world. None of them have treated a thought as nothing that their face treated as everything. Silence stretched between them like something about to be decided, and then his tablet chimed. An urgent alert from Director Yoon. Emergency protocol session. Now. He looked at the screen, looked back up. She had almost smiled again. Go, she said. We will have the unfinished conversation another time. He walked down the corridor fast, tablet in hand, telling himself his heart rate was just from the sudden movement. It wasn't. Behind him, in the doorway of the empty briefing room, Sarah stood for a moment longer than she needed to. Her expression, had anyone been there to see it, was not the diplomatic neutral she wore in every meeting. It was something warmer than that, quieter, something she also, for now, chose not to say out loud. The emergency protocol session lasted 4 hours. Daniel sat through all of it, taking notes, translating, flagging cultural sensitivities, doing his job with the muscle memory of someone who had learned to function while his brain was somewhere else entirely. Director Yoon spoke. Senior diplomats spoke. Someone from the UN office in New York joined via screen and spoke for 40 minutes without saying anything that needed 40 minutes. Daniel wrote everything down and understood almost none of it, because he kept thinking about the way she'd said another time. Not goodbye. Not the formal Velorian closing phrase he'd memorized on page 37 of the briefing document. Just another time. Easy and certain. The way you say something when you already know it's true. He walked back to his apartment at 2 in the morning through empty Geneva streets, hands in his pockets, trying to have a rational conversation with himself. It went poorly. The next morning he arrived at the facility early, which he always did. That was normal. That meant nothing. Sarah was already in the East Garden. This was not in her schedule. He knew her schedule the way he knew his own name at this point, and the East Garden at 7:15 was not on it. She was standing at the far end, near the old stone wall, looking out over the lake, still wearing the deep blue of her diplomatic uniform, but without the formal outer layer. Just the base garment, fitted and quiet. She looked like someone who had been there a while. He almost turned around. He didn't. "You're early," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I do not sleep the way humans do." She didn't turn immediately. "We have a rest state, approximately 90 minutes. After that, the mind continues whether you want it to or not." A pause. "I found the garden preferable to the ceiling." He stood beside her and looked at the lake. The morning light was doing something complicated on the water. It was the kind of morning that made Geneva look like someone had painted it specifically to impress visitors. "What does the mind do?" he asked, for the hours after. "Thinks," she glanced at him sideways. "Finishes conversations." He felt that somewhere in his chest region. And did it? Finish them? She was quiet for a moment. The lake moved. A bird crossed the sky in a hurry, going somewhere important. "No," she said finally. It raised further questions. This was the moment he should have steered them back towards something professional. He knew that. He was good at steering. He'd been doing it for 3 weeks. "What kind of questions?" he asked instead. She turned to look at him fully then, and there was something in her expression he hadn't seen before. Not the assessment from the landing pad, not the diplomatic neutral from the meeting rooms. Something more unguarded than either. And clearly she knew it because she held his gaze for only a second before looking back at the water. "Questions that are not relevant to the diplomatic mission," she said, "and therefore not appropriate to raise." He nodded slowly, looked at the water too. They stood there together in the kind of silence that isn't empty, the kind that has weight to it, presence, the shape of things neither person is saying. He thought, this is fine, this is professional. This is 2 people standing near a lake. His thoughts remained unconvincing. The day's sessions were a specific kind of difficult. Not because anything went wrong. Everything went correctly. Every exchange was navigated well. Every cultural landmine avoided. Every piece of protocol observed. Externally, Daniel Mercer was exactly what he was paid to be. Internally, he was having an experience. The thing was, he'd worked with dozens of diplomats over 6 years. He understood the mechanics of professional distance. He was, by most accounts, unusually good at maintaining it. He was not a person who fell for people he worked with. He was not a person who lost focus. He was, apparently, becoming a different person. It wasn't even the obvious things. It wasn't the amber eyes or the silver hair or the low-light luminescence that the briefing document had criminally undersold. It was the small things. The way she listened, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually listening. Like what you were saying was the only thing in the room. The way she asked questions that went one layer deeper than anyone expected. The way she had read 412 pages of briefing material on a species she was visiting for 6 weeks because she considered it discourteous not to understand the people she was meeting. He kept thinking about what she'd said. Unexpressed thoughts are unfinished conversations. Like keeping something inside you was a kind of rudeness. Like honesty was a basic courtesy rather than a risk. That concept was doing something to his nervous system that he couldn't fully explain. After the afternoon session, during the 30-minute break before the final evening briefing, he found himself in the small side corridor off the main meeting room, eating a sandwich he couldn't taste, reading through tomorrow's schedule with the focus of a man aggressively pretending to be focused. "You do that when you are uncomfortable," Sarah said. He looked up. She had appeared in the corridor with no dramatic announcement, which was very her. "Do what?" "Read things you have already read." She leaned against the opposite wall, arms loose at her sides. "You reviewed tomorrow's schedule this morning. I saw you. You have now reviewed it 3 more times today." He looked down at the tablet, looked back up. "I like to be thorough." "Daniel." She said his name the way she always said it, clean and direct, no softening edges, like she'd decided exactly how to say it and committed. "I have a question that is not on any agenda." His sandwich sat forgotten in his hand. "All right. On your world, when 2 people have an unfinished conversation," she said carefully, "and both of them are aware that it is unfinished, and yet both of them continue to discuss other things instead, what is the reason for that?" He was quiet for a moment. "Usually, fear. Fear of what outcome? The wrong answer," he paused. "Or sometimes the right one." She considered this with the particular stillness she had, where her whole body seemed to give the thought room. Those seem like opposite fears. They are. Humans hold a lot of contradictions. I have noticed. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. That almost smile she'd been withholding since day one. "We do not have an equivalent concept in Velorian, a fear of the right answer. Lucky you. I am not certain it is luck. I think it is simply a different relationship with honesty." She straightened from the wall, and he was suddenly aware of how quiet the corridor was, how still. On Veloria, when something is true, we consider it better to have it in the open than in the chest. Easier, also. Things that sit in the chest become heavier. He looked at her. She looked at him. His chest at that moment felt like it weighed about 47 pounds more than usual. The chime for the evening briefing sounded through the building. Neither of them moved for a full 3 seconds. Then they both turned toward the main room, and Daniel fell into step beside her, and the professional distance reassembled around them like it always did. But something had shifted. The unfinished conversation was getting harder to leave unfinished. 3 days later, Director Yoon called him into her office. He sat across from her desk and waited. Director Yoon was the kind of person who didn't ease into things, which he respected, and which also meant these conversations tended to start somewhere uncomfortable. "The Velorian Assembly contacted me this morning," she said. "About the Thursday session?" "About you." She set down her pen. "Specifically, the third voice has submitted a formal request to extend your assignment beyond the standard rotation. She's requesting you as her dedicated cultural liaison for the remainder of the visit, and," she paused here, reading from her screen, "for any subsequent visits to Earth over the coming years." The room was very quiet. "She put that in writing?" Daniel said. "Formally and officially, through the Assembly's diplomatic channel, which is," Director Yoon picked the pen back up, "not something they do casually. The Velorian Diplomatic Corps does not file formal requests for individual human staff members. In 6 years of Earth contact operations, this has not happened once." She looked at him over her reading glasses. "Do you want to tell me if there's anything I should know about?" He thought about East Garden mornings, about unfinished conversations, about things that sit in the chest and get heavier. "No," he said. "There's nothing inappropriate." Director Yoon studied him for a moment. "I didn't say inappropriate. I said anything I should know about." He met her eyes. "She's exceptional at her work. We communicate well. I imagine that's what it's about." Director Yoon made the face of someone who has been in diplomacy long enough to know exactly what is and isn't being said. "I'm approving the request," she said. "Effective immediately. Extended assignment, full rotation. You report to her schedule." He nodded, stood to leave. "Daniel," she stopped him at the door, same as Sarah had 3 nights ago. He was beginning to notice a pattern with doors and his name. "I have worked in this facility for 11 years. I have watched a lot of people try to maintain professional distance with remarkable people they've been assigned to work with." He waited. "It's a reasonable thing to try," she said, and then she looked back at her screen. He walked out. He was almost certain she hadn't finished that sentence. That evening, when the sessions ended and the building thinned out, he went to the East Garden. He told himself he was getting air. He was getting air. That was all. She was there again. He wasn't surprised. He was starting to understand her rhythms the way you understand weather. Not by prediction, but by feel. He stood beside her at the stone wall. The lake was darker now. The last of the sun stretched thin on the horizon. "The Assembly approved your extended request," he said. "Yes." She was looking at the water. Director Yoon seemed surprised. I imagine she was. No apology in her voice, no deflection. He let that sit for a moment. "Can I ask you something that's not on any agenda?" She turned to look at him. The amber eyes caught the last of the light. "Please," she said. He took a breath. "Why me, specifically? There are senior liaisons with more years, better language scores. Why file a formal request for me?" The almost smile appeared. And this time, unlike every time before, it finished. It became an actual smile, quiet and certain, like something she'd been holding in reserve, waiting to see if it was warranted. "Because," she said, "you are the only person in this facility who reads 400 pages to understand someone, and then listens to them as though the pages told you nothing." He had no answer for that. His throat had apparently stopped cooperating. "Also," she added, looking back at the water, her voice dropping to something almost private, "I have things in my chest that are becoming very heavy, and I believe you are the only human on this planet I would trust with the weight of them." The lake moved. The last sun disappeared. He stood there beside her in the dark that was filling the garden, and he thought that he was in a very significant amount of trouble. And for the first time since this started, he wasn't particularly interested in talking himself out of it. There is a specific kind of morning that only exists after a night where everything changed and nothing happened. Daniel knew this kind because he'd had a few in his life. The morning after his father's funeral. The morning after he'd submitted his resignation from his first job, the one that was safe and wrong in equal measure. Mornings where the world looked identical to the day before, but you moved through it differently, like the gravity had been quietly adjusted while you slept. This was one of those mornings. He showered, dressed, made coffee he actually tasted for once, and sat at his kitchen table running through exactly what had occurred the previous evening. She had said she trusted him with the weight of things in her chest. He had stood there like a man who had forgotten that responses were an option. And then, after a silence that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer, she had said goodnight, formally and cleanly, and walked back inside. He had stood in the garden alone for another 10 minutes, listening to the lake do nothing useful. That was all. Nothing had happened. Everything had changed. He finished his coffee and went to work. She was already in the morning briefing when he arrived, seated at the table between two senior Velorian delegates, reviewing documents with the focused attention she brought to everything. She looked up when he walked in. Their eyes met for approximately 1 second. Then she looked back at her documents. That 1 second did more damage than most conversations. He sat down, opened his tablet, and began the day. The session was about trade protocols, specifically the exchange of scientific knowledge, Velorian agricultural technology for human advancements in deep space navigation. It was genuinely significant, the kind of negotiation that would matter for a generation. And Daniel was good enough at his job to care about it properly, even while part of his brain was running a separate and entirely unhelpful background process. He noticed things, though, small things that had nothing to do with trade protocols. When he spoke, she listened with that particular attention of hers, the kind that made you feel like what you were saying was the only sound in the room. When she spoke, she occasionally used phrasings that were slightly more human than necessary, small linguistic choices that weren't in the formal Velorian diplomatic register, but that she'd picked up somewhere. From him, he realized slowly. She'd been picking them up from him. He wasn't sure what to do with that information, so he set it carefully aside. Lunch was a standing buffet in the West Hall. Daniel filled a plate with things he didn't look at, and found a quiet corner near the windows, eating with the focused efficiency of someone buying themselves 5 minutes of not needing to perform. She appeared next to him with a plate of her own. No announcement, just appeared, the way she did. The morning session went well, she said. It did. He kept his eyes on the room. Professional. Measured. The Trade Council seemed satisfied with the agricultural framework. Yes. A pause. That is not what I wanted to talk about. He looked at her then. She was looking at the room too, same as him, both of them facing outward like two people watching the same horizon. Last night, he said carefully. Last night, she agreed. The West Hall murmured around them, plates and voices and the particular white noise of institutional diplomacy. Nobody was watching them. Nobody was near enough to hear. I said something, she said, that I meant. I want to be clear that I meant it. I am not in the habit of saying things I do not mean. But I recognize that on your world, that kind of statement can sometimes be interpreted as more than intended, or less, and I would rather be precise than leave it to interpretation. He waited. I trust you, she said simply. That is specific and real. What it means beyond that, I am... A pause. The first hesitation he'd ever heard from her. Still determining. He nodded slowly. Outside the window, Geneva went about its business, entirely unaware it was being used as a backdrop for something complicated. Can I be equally precise? He asked. I would prefer it. I think I stopped being neutral about this about 10 days ago. He kept his voice even, careful. I'm aware that's a problem I need to manage. You're here for 3 more weeks. We're working together. There are about 100 reasons why whatever I'm feeling isn't useful information. She was quiet for a moment. And yet, she said. And yet, he exhaled. It's there. She turned her head to look at him fully. He turned to look at her. They were close in the way people get when they're pretending not to be having a significant conversation. On Veloria, she said, we have a concept. It does not translate well, but approximately. An emotion that has no current action but deserves acknowledgement. We give it a word because unnamed things become confused things. We name it, accept that it exists, and then, she tilted her head slightly, we see what it becomes. What's the word? She said something. 23 syllables, a sound his throat couldn't manage. The Velorian word for a feeling with no action yet, but too much truth to ignore. I don't have an equivalent in any of my 4 languages, he said. No, I checked. She turned back to the room. Your species seems to prefer the confusion. He almost laughed. He stopped it in time, but only barely. We're working on it. They stood there together in their quiet corner of the West Hall, and the conversation settled into something neither of them needed to keep building. It was enough, for now. Named and set down and allowed to be there without anyone needing to decide what it was yet. It was the most honest he'd felt in years, standing in a buffet line in Geneva saying nothing in particular. The following week arrived and brought complications, as weeks tend to do when you'd rather they didn't. The first complication was external. 3 days into what should have been a routine continuation of negotiations, the Velorian senior delegate, First Voice Carathan, called an unscheduled closed session. Daniel was not invited. Neither were most of the human senior staff. Director Yoon was called in, but came back 2 hours later with an expression he'd never seen on her before. She found him in the corridor outside the translation office. We have a situation, she said. What kind? She glanced up and down the corridor. The Velorian Assembly received communication this morning from their diplomatic monitoring body. 3 other species have approached them this week about Earth, specifically about Earth's eligibility for full galactic community membership. Daniel absorbed this. That's good news, isn't it? It should be. She lowered her voice. 2 of the 3 species are flagging concerns, cultural ones. They're arguing that humanity is too unstable for full membership, too conflict-prone. They're recommending observer status only, which is essentially a polite way of keeping us at arm's length indefinitely. She paused. The Velorian Assembly has been asked to submit an official assessment. Their vote carries significant weight with the membership committee. He stood very still. When? 16 days. They submit their formal recommendation in 16 days. She looked at him. And their cultural exchange visit was always partly an assessment, Daniel. You knew that. He had known that. It had been in the briefing document, page 12. He just hadn't fully considered what it meant while standing in East Gardens and West Hall lunch breaks, having quiet conversations that were going to matter more than he'd understood. He found Sarah that evening outside the library annex, where she often went after formal sessions when she needed to think. She was standing at the window overlooking the courtyard, and she turned when he came in. One look at his face and she knew. You heard. Director Yoon told me. He stopped a few feet from her. Why didn't you say anything? Because the assessment and what exists between us are separate things. I did not want you to conflate them. Are they? Separate? Yes. Direct and clear, no hesitation. What I observe about your species for the Assembly's recommendation, and what I feel when I talk to you at night beside the lake, those do not inform each other. I am capable of keeping them apart. And what do you observe? He asked. About my species. She held his gaze for a long moment. I observe, she said carefully, a species that carries enormous capacity for destruction and has not destroyed itself, that builds hospitals next to battlefields, that writes poetry about loss while the loss is still happening, that reads 400 pages to understand a stranger and still manages to listen as though the pages told them nothing. She paused. I observe a species that is very frightened and very brave in the same breath, often without realizing it is both simultaneously. He stood in the quiet library annex and felt something move through him that he didn't have a clean name for. Is that enough? He asked. For the recommendation? That is not a question I can answer yet. She held his gaze. But I will tell you this. In 4,000 years of Velorian diplomatic history, we have never encountered a species that surprised us. Every civilization we have met, we understood before we arrived. We had models, predictions, certainties. She tilted her head. You are the first species that has surprised us, every day. That is not a small thing, Daniel. To a civilization 4,000 years old, surprise is extraordinary. He looked at her. She looked at him. I need to tell you something, he said. Tell me. That night in the garden, when you said you had things in your chest that were becoming heavy. He paused, choosing carefully. I have the same problem, and I'm less good at naming it than you are. And I don't have a 23-syllable word for it, but it's there. And it has nothing to do with the assessment or the recommendation or any of the reasons this is complicated. He exhaled. I just thought you should know. Precisely. The library was very quiet. Sarah looked at him with the amber eyes that had stopped his brain on a landing pad 5 weeks ago, and the almost smile moved through her expression like light through water. I know, she said softly. I have known for some time. And? She was quiet for 3 full seconds. And I think, she said, that there are still 11 days before I need to submit the cultural portion of the assessment. And tonight, if you are willing, I would like to have the rest of the unfinished conversation. He looked at her. She looked back. He said yes. And outside the library window, the Geneva courtyard sat in its evening quiet, entirely unbothered, while somewhere in that room, the gravity shifted again. The second complication arrived the next morning, and it was significantly less poetic. His tablet lit up at 6:15 with a priority flag from the UN liaison office. He read it standing in his kitchen, still in yesterday's clothes because he hadn't gone home until very late, and the unfinished conversation had finally been finished, and he had walked home through Geneva at 2 in the morning, feeling like the city had been repainted while he wasn't looking. The flag read, Formal complaint filed against Cultural Liaison Daniel Mercer, re. Inappropriate personal conduct with Velorian diplomatic personnel. Investigation pending. Report to Director Yoon's office, 0800. He put the tablet down on the counter, picked it up, read it again, put it down, stood in his kitchen for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular. Then he got dressed, made coffee, and went to work. Director Yoon's office felt smaller than usual at 8 in the morning. Daniel sat across from her desk and watched her read something on her screen with the expression of a person who had hoped their morning would go differently. Behind her, Geneva was doing its usual thing through the window. Clouds moving, lake sitting there, city completely indifferent to the specific crisis happening 4 floors above it. The complaint was filed at 11:40 last night, Director Yoon said without looking up. Through the UN Diplomatic Oversight Channel. Anonymous submission. Anonymous, Daniel repeated. Which is allowed under the protocol framework. Frustrating, but allowed. She set down her pen. It alleges that you've developed a personal relationship with the third voice that compromises the integrity of the cultural exchange mission and potentially the assessment process. He kept his voice even. Who would have access to that channel? Any senior staff member in this facility. Any member of the Velorian delegation. Any UN oversight officer. She finally looked at him. That's a long list. What happens now? A review. 3 days, standard timeline. You're suspended from active liaison duties during the review period. She held up a hand before he could respond. I know. I pushed back. The protocol is automatic on a formal complaint. I don't have discretion here. He nodded slowly, looked at his hands, looked back up. Is there anything I should know, Director Yoon said, before this review starts? Anything that would be better coming from you than from an investigator? He thought about the library annex. The unfinished conversation finally finished. The walk home at 2 in the morning through streets that felt repainted. Nothing happened that compromised the assessment, he said. Or the mission. That's not quite what I asked. No, he said. It isn't. Director Yoon studied him for a long moment. She had the eyes of someone who had seen 11 years of complicated situations and knew the difference between a person making a mistake and a person navigating something genuinely difficult. Go home, she said finally. 3 days. Don't contact anyone from the delegation. Let the review run. A pause. And Daniel, when it's done, if it comes back clear, we're going to have a different conversation about what happens next. Not about protocol, about practicalities. He nodded, stood, stopped at the door because apparently that was just where his important conversations lived now. The recommendation, he said, 11 days. If I'm suspended for 3, I know the timeline. She looked back at her screen. So does she, presumably. He left. 3 days is not a long time in most contexts. In the context of sitting in your apartment knowing that something important is happening without you, 3 days is a specific kind of endless. He read. He cooked badly. He ran along the lake in the mornings at a pace that was less exercise and more argument with himself. He thought about the complaint, about who filed it and why, about the fact that someone in that building had been watching closely enough to notice something neither he nor Sarah had discussed openly, which meant they'd been less careful than he'd believed, or someone had been more attentive than they should have been. He thought about what Director Yoon had said. When it's done, we're going to have a different conversation about practicalities. He knew what that meant. He'd known it was coming even before the complaint. The practical reality had been sitting in the background of everything for weeks, patient and inevitable. She was leaving in 11 days. She was going back to Veloria. Her world was a 17-day journey, even on the fastest Velorian vessel, and the diplomatic exchange program had no provision for personal relationships between liaison staff and delegates. And even if it did, the framework for what that would even mean between a human and a Velorian was something nobody had ever written, because nobody had apparently needed to write it before. He was good at his job because he understood the shape of problems before they became critical. He understood the shape of this one. He just couldn't find the part of himself that cared about the shape the way he was supposed to. On the second afternoon, his tablet lit up with a message from an internal address he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it. Then he read the header. From the office of the Velorian Diplomatic Assembly, third voice, personal correspondence. He sat up. The message was 3 sentences long. I was informed of the complaint this morning. I want you to know that I have submitted a formal statement to the review board detailing the exact nature of our interactions, without omission. I also want you to know that I have no intention of allowing someone else's action to determine what is true. He read it 3 times, put the tablet down, picked it up and read it again. There were things he wanted to say back. 12 different responses formed and dissolved. In the end, he wrote 2 words. Thank you. Sent it before he could decide if it was enough. Her reply came 4 minutes later. 1 word. Obviously. He sat in his apartment smiling at a single word on a screen, like a man who had completely lost the plot. He was fine with that. The review came back clear on the morning of the 3rd day. No misconduct, no compromise of mission integrity. The investigator's notes cited the formal Velorian statement as decisive, specifically the third voice's own account, which had apparently been detailed enough and direct enough, and so specifically Velorian in its commitment to precision over diplomatic softening, that the review board had closed the file inside 24 hours, and then taken 2 more days to handle the paperwork. Daniel was reinstated. Effective immediately. He walked back into the facility at 10:15 and went straight to his desk and opened the day's schedule. Back to work. Head down. Professional. Director Yoon appeared in his doorway at 10:30. Welcome back, she said. And then, because she was Director Yoon, my office, 15 minutes. The conversation I mentioned. He went. She closed the door, which she didn't usually do. 8 days. She said, sitting down. 8 days, he agreed. After which the Velorian delegation returns home, the cultural exchange program concludes, and the diplomatic relationship transitions to the standard long-distance consultation framework, which means monthly communication windows, formal channels only, and liaison assignments rotated every 6 months as standard. She looked at him steadily. You know all of this. I do. And? He was quiet for a moment. I haven't figured out the answer to that question yet. Neither has she, I suspect. Director Yoon leaned back. For what it's worth, I've worked with a lot of diplomatic relationships. Cultural exchanges between species, between nations, between people who have no reasonable business caring about each other as much as they do. I've seen it work, and I've seen it fail, and the difference is almost never about the distance. A pause. It's about whether both people are willing to be inconvenienced. He looked at her. Is this you giving me advice? This is me saying that I received a communication this morning from the Velorian Assembly, separate from the exchange program. A formal inquiry about the possibility of a permanent cultural liaison position attached to the Velorian Diplomatic Corps. Earth-based, with quarterly residency periods on Veloria. She slid a document across the desk. It's a new position, one that has never existed before. He looked at the document, looked up at her. She created it? He asked. The Assembly created it, at the formal request of the third voice, who submitted the proposal 6 days ago. Director Yoon's expression was professionally neutral in the way that meant she had significant feelings she was choosing not to display. 3 days before the complaint was even filed, he sat with that for a moment. 6 days ago. She had done this 6 days ago, which was the same day as the West Hall lunch and the first real conversation, and the precise alignment of weight and truth, and the unnamed Velorian word that translated roughly as a feeling with no action yet. She had heard that and gone and built him a door. The position would require you to leave the facility, Director Yoon said. Leave my team. Transition to the Assembly's diplomatic structure. It's a significant change. A pause. It would also make you the first human being to hold an official role within the Velorian diplomatic corps, which is not nothing, historically speaking. He was still looking at the document. I need to talk to her, he said. Obviously. Director Yoon stood, smoothing her jacket. She's in the East Garden. She's been there for 40 minutes. She said this with the tone of someone who had already known exactly how this meeting was going to end. The East Garden was pale with late morning light. She was at the far wall. Of course she was. Because some things establish a pattern early, and then simply keep being true. He walked across the garden and stopped beside her, and they both looked at the lake for a moment, the way they'd learned to do, using the water as a place to put their eyes while they found their words. You built a position, he said. I submitted a proposal. Her voice was careful. The Assembly approved it on its own merits. Increased cultural understanding between species, improved long-term diplomatic relations. It is a sound argument. I'm sure it is. He paused. That's not why you did it. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. It is not the only reason. He turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. The amber eyes in the morning light were doing something that the briefing document had definitely failed to adequately prepare him for. Someone filed that complaint, he said. Someone in that building watched us and decided to make it a problem. And you responded by making it permanent. I responded by making it possible, she corrected quietly. What you do with the possibility is not my decision. He stood there in the East Garden with the lake doing its indifferent thing in the background. And he looked at the woman who had read 400 pages before she arrived, and listened like every word was the only word, and filed a statement so precise and honest it closed a review board in 24 hours, and built a door in a wall she couldn't be certain he'd walk through. I need to ask you something, he said. Directly. Please, if I say no to this position, if I say the distance is too complicated and the change is too large, and the rational thing is to let this be what it was and move on cleanly. He held her gaze. What does that look like for you? She took a breath. The first time he'd ever seen her do that. The full, steadying breath of someone who is being honest, when honesty costs something. It looks like returning to Veloria with something in my chest that has become very heavy, she said, and finding, eventually, a Velorian word for what it is. A pause. We have many words for loss. We are a very old civilization. We have had time to name everything we have lost. Her voice was steady, but something under it was not. I would prefer this time not to need one. The garden was absolutely quiet. Somewhere inside the facility, people were doing important things, negotiations that would matter for a generation, recommendations that would shape humanity's place in the galaxy, enormous things moving on enormous schedules. Daniel looked at Sarah and felt none of that. He felt the particular and specific weight of a moment that doesn't announce itself as important while it's happening. The kind that you only fully understand later, when you're older, when someone asks you where it started and you say, there. That morning, the lake, the light, her looking at me like a door she had already decided to open. I have 4 languages, he said slowly. None of them have the right word either. She waited. But I know what it means, he said, and I know what the position means, and I know that the rational, practical, sensible response to all of it is to take about 3 weeks and think it through carefully. He paused. I'm not going to do that. Something moved across her face. Daniel. She reached out, took his hand. Her fingers were cool and certain, a different temperature than human, a different weight somehow, specific and real, and nothing like anything that had come before. Good, she said softly, because I have many things to show you. My world is very large. He looked at her hand in his, looked at her. I have time, he said. Around them, Geneva continued its morning completely unbothered, and the lake moved the way it always moved. And 8 days suddenly felt like the beginning of something, rather than the end. The last 8 days moved the way time moves when you want it to slow down. Too fast in the mornings, too loud in the afternoons. The evenings almost bearable because the evenings were theirs, the East Garden and the lake, and the kind of conversation that had no agenda and no protocol and no end time anyone was enforcing. Daniel submitted his formal acceptance of the assembly position on day 6. He signed the transfer paperwork. He packed up his desk in the translation office, which took less time than he expected because he had always traveled light, kept only what was necessary, a habit from years of knowing that assignments ended, and the smart thing was to not accumulate what you couldn't carry. He was beginning to understand that this particular habit was about to be tested. Director Yoon shook his hand on day 7, held it for a moment longer than a handshake required. "You're going to be fine," she said. "I know," he said. "I wasn't talking to you," she replied and let go, and walked away. And he almost asked what she meant, and then understood she meant the facility, the team, the work he'd been doing here for 6 years that would now be someone else's. He stood in the empty translation office for 5 minutes, looked at the desk that had been his, the window, the particular angle of Geneva light that came through it at 3 in the afternoon that he'd never consciously noticed and would probably miss for the rest of his life. Then he closed the door and went to find her. The last formal session of the cultural exchange program was scheduled for day 8, the morning of departure. A closing ceremony, speeches, the ritual exchange of symbolic gifts that both sides had been preparing for weeks. Daniel sat in his new capacity, not as facility liaison but as the Assembly's cultural attaché, a title so new it didn't have a desk yet, watching the ceremony from a position slightly to the left of where he used to sit. The geometry of the room looked different from here. Everything looked different from slightly different positions. He was learning this. First voice Carathan spoke for the Velorian delegation. He was formal, measured, ancient in the particular way of someone whose civilization had been doing this long enough that ceremony had become reflex. His words were gracious. His assessment, read aloud in the chamber, was generous. Humanity, he said, demonstrated inconsistencies typical of young civilizations. Conflict rates above galactic average. Significant internal division. The usual markers that made the membership committee cautious. But, and here Carathan paused in a way that made the room very quiet. But humanity also demonstrated something the Velorian Assembly had not encountered in 4,000 years of galactic engagement. An adaptability, not just of behavior, but of understanding. The capacity not merely to learn information, but to be genuinely changed by it. To meet a stranger and be altered by the meeting. To hold 2 contradictory truths simultaneously and keep moving. The formal recommendation, he said, was full membership consideration within 2 standard galactic cycles. The fastest recommendation the Assembly had submitted in recorded history. The human side of the room exhaled collectively. Daniel looked across the chamber to where Sarah sat at the Velorian table, composed and correct and giving nothing away to the room. She felt him looking. She didn't turn, but the corner of her mouth moved. That was enough. The reception after the ceremony was the kind of event that existed to give important people something to do with their hands while they said important things to each other. Daniel moved through it doing the job he'd always done, smoothing edges, filling silences, being the person who made transitions feel natural. Except now he was doing it as someone who was leaving with them. That was a strange thing to feel in a room full of people he'd worked beside for years. Not sad exactly. More like the particular feeling of a story that has found its next chapter. The sense of a door closing that is not the same as an ending. He was talking to a junior delegate about the navigation charts for the return journey when he felt someone stop beside him. He turned. It was one of the senior Velorian aides, a man named Voss, careful and quiet, who had been with the delegation since the first day and had, Daniel now realized, been watching him for most of those weeks with an expression he hadn't fully interpreted until this moment. It was the expression of someone who had filed a complaint. He didn't know it for certain. He had no proof. But he knew it the way you know some things, through accumulation, through pattern, through the specific way a person holds themselves when they are waiting to see how something they did turned out. He looked at Voss for a moment. Voss looked back. Attaché Mercer, Voss said, the title, deliberate. Aide Voss, Daniel replied, a beat of silence. The Assembly's decision regarding your position was not one I anticipated, Voss said. His voice was neutral, but the neutrality was working hard. Neither did I, Daniel said honestly. The third voice is, Voss paused, choosing, exceptional in her judgment. In most matters. Daniel held the man's gaze. She is. In all of them, in my experience. Another beat. Voss looked at him with something that was not quite hostility and not quite acceptance. Something in between that might, given enough time, move in either direction. Veloria is not Earth, Voss said finally. The adjustment will be significant. I expect so. Many humans would find it difficult. The climate, the customs, he searched for the word, weight of 4,000 years of history in every room you enter. Probably, Daniel agreed. He kept his voice easy. Good thing I like reading long documents. Voss looked at him for another moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but the absence of active opposition, which was its own kind of beginning. The third voice briefed the full delegation last night, Voss said, about your appointment, about its purpose. A pause. She was precise. She usually is. She said, Voss looked down briefly, then back up, that humanity's greatest asset was not its technology or its resources or even its adaptability. She said it was its capacity to make a stranger feel known. He said it the way people say things they didn't expect to find meaningful. I found that observation difficult to dispute. He walked away. Daniel stood there holding his drink and let that settle. The shuttle was scheduled for midday. He had one bag. Everything else had been shipped ahead through the Assembly's logistics channel, which was efficient in the way that 4,000 years of practice made things efficient. Quietly and completely. No drama. Just done. He carried the bag to the shuttle bay. The Velorian delegation was already assembling. Assistants and aides and senior delegates arranging themselves with the practiced ease of people who had done this 100 times. The shuttle itself was larger than the one they'd arrived in, a longer journey requiring more provision, and it sat on the landing pad looking considerably more permanent than anything Daniel had organized his life around before. He stopped at the edge of the pad and looked at it for a moment. Thought, this is actually happening. Felt the specific and irreversible reality of that fact settle through him from the top down. Then he thought about unfinished conversations, about East gardens and stone walls and a lake that didn't care about any of it, about a woman who read everything before she arrived and still listened like the reading had told her nothing, about 23 syllables and unnamed feelings and the weight of things that had been in his chest for weeks demanding to be said out loud. He picked up his bag and walked onto the pad. She was standing at the shuttle ramp. Not by accident. She was there the way she was always somewhere on purpose. Because Sarah did not end up in places. She went to them. She was watching him cross the pad. The diplomatic composure was in place. The outer layer of professional correctness she wore like a second uniform. But her eyes were doing what they always did when it was just the two of them. Being honest without requiring her face to commit. He stopped in front of her. Ready? She asked. No, he said. She raised an eyebrow. But I'm going anyway, he added, which I think is the point. The almost smile. He had watched it appear and retreat and appear again for 8 weeks, and it still did something to his chest every time. That, she said, is a very human answer. I'm working with what I have. She looked at him for a moment. Around them the delegation was boarding, the quiet, organized movement of a mission concluding. And nobody was watching them particularly. And the Geneva sky was doing something wide and clean above the pad. And Daniel thought that this was probably the last time he would stand on this specific ground for a long time. And he found that he didn't mind. I need to tell you something, she said. Her voice had dropped to the register she used when she wasn't performing for any room. The real one. Before we board, while we are still here. He waited. I have submitted 47 diplomatic assessments in my career, she said. I have visited 19 worlds. I have met representatives of 31 species. I have been precise and thorough and correct in my judgments, because precision and thoroughness are what the work requires. She held his gaze. I have never, in 47 assessments and 19 worlds, written a recommendation based on one person. He was very still. The assessment I submitted was honest, she said carefully. Everything in it was true. Humanity's adaptability, its capacity for change, its ability to make a stranger feel known. A pause. But I want you to understand that I did not know those things were true about your species, until I knew them about you specifically. He looked at her. You changed my assessment, she said simply. Not because you tried to, not because it was your job, because you were exactly what you were, and it turned out that was sufficient to change the mind of someone 4,000 years of civilization had not managed to surprise before. The shuttle bay was quiet around them. The boarding had slowed. Someone, somewhere, was being professionally oblivious. He set his bag down. Sarah. Yes, I have something in my chest that has become very heavy, and I've been waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. He watched her face. I think this is the moment. She waited. Her breath was the steadying kind again. He said, I love you. I know the word probably translates badly, and I know there's a 23-syllable Velorian equivalent that covers it more precisely, and I'll learn it. I'll learn all of it. But right now in this language, this is what I have, and it's true, and I needed you to know before we got on that ship. The Geneva sky sat above them. The lake, somewhere behind the facility walls, moved the way it always moved. Sarah looked at him, and the almost smile that had been retreating and appearing for 8 weeks stopped doing either. It became something else, something fuller and quieter and entirely her own. The expression of someone who has been precise about everything her whole life and has found, finally, something she does not want to measure. She reached up, took his face in her hands the way someone handles something real and valuable, with full attention and no performance. Daniel, she said softly. Yeah, I wish you could have seen your face, she said. The morning I arrived, on the landing pad, her thumbs moved. You looked like someone had removed all the floor. He laughed. Actual, unguarded, surprised out of him. That's a terrible thing to say at this moment. It is the truth. You looked completely undone, and I thought, her voice softened further, something private moving through it. I thought, this one sees me. Not the title, not the mission, not the 4,000 years, just me. His throat did something inconvenient. I have never been just seen before, she said. Not like that, not in the first moment. She held his face and held his gaze. I did not know what to do with it. I kept waiting for it to become something smaller, something more manageable. A pause. It kept becoming larger instead. The shuttle bay was entirely still. I love you, she said. And she said it in English, not Velorian, his language not hers. The deliberate choice of someone who understood exactly what they were doing. I have been trying to find the appropriate moment to say that with the necessary precision for approximately 6 weeks. I do not think there is an appropriate moment. I think there is only this one. He covered her hands with his. Okay, he said. His voice was not completely steady. He didn't try to fix that. Okay, she agreed. They stood there for a moment, hands and foreheads close, the two of them in the middle of everything that came next. Then, from the shuttle ramp, someone cleared their throat with the diplomatic restraint of a person who absolutely did not want to interrupt, but had a departure schedule to maintain. Sarah pulled back slightly. Her eyes were bright, not sad, not overwhelmed. Bright the way things are when they're real. We should board, she said. We should, he agreed. He picked up his bag. She fell into step beside him, and they walked up the ramp together, into the interior of the shuttle, into the close and organized warmth of a ship that was about to take him somewhere he had never been, toward a life that had no template. He found a seat by the window. She sat beside him, not across, not one row forward, beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. She didn't comment on it. Neither did he. The shuttle sealed, the engines built toward departure. Through the window, Geneva shrank, the facility, the East Garden, the stone wall, the lake that had witnessed everything and offered nothing, and been there anyway, patient and indifferent, and somehow exactly right. He watched it until he couldn't see it anymore. Then he looked forward. Sarah's hand found his on the armrest. Not reaching, just arriving. the way she went places on purpose. He turned his hand over, held on. The shuttle broke through the cloud layer and the sky went dark, and then extraordinary, the full scatter of space opening above them like something that had been there all along, waiting to be entered. He looked at it, thought, this is actually happening, felt it, completely and without reservation. My world is 17 days from here, she said quietly, looking out the same window. Tell me about it, he said. So she did. Somewhere far below, on a stone wall beside a lake that didn't care about any of it, the East Garden sat empty in the afternoon light. 8 weeks ago, a man had stood there trying to be professional. The lake had always known how that was going to end. If this story hit you somewhere real, if you've ever stood on a landing pad of your own, watching someone walk toward you and feeling the floor disappear, you already know what Daniel felt. That's what HFY does best. Not the battles, not the firepower. The moments when being human, completely and vulnerably human, turns out to be the most powerful thing in any room. If you want more stories like this one, stories that make you feel something you didn't see coming, hit subscribe. There are more of them waiting, and if this one meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear that love. Even the inconvenient and complicated and 17 light years away kind is worth saying out loud. HFY, Soundscape. We'll see you in the next one.